to speak of such a great personality, a spiritual giant as Bhagavan Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa is always a humbling experience. And whatever we may choose to explore of his oceanic presence and work, we will always fall short. I propose, therefore, to limit myself to a glimpse, but a glimpse which will be of the larger picture of his work in the context of the history of India's spirituality, beginning with the Vedas through to today and pointing towards a glorious future. First, we must understand who he was before we can fully understand why he came on earth and what work he accomplished. Sri Aurobindo has some profoundly insightful observations when he was asked to some questions by disciples. He made certain observations, but on his own, without being asked any question, in his thoughts and aphorisms, Sri Aurobindo places before us this statement: who was Ramakrishna? And then he himself answers, God manifest in a human being. He was an avatar as much as Christ or Chaitanya, who had a definite purpose to fulfill in the spiritual evolution of humanity. And what is that purpose? He points out, to found and establish the truth of the unity of all spiritual experience and realization. And this is the work for which he came. But then Sri Aurobindo also points out that his approach, his method to realize and establish this unity, he says, he was bound by no man-made rules, though he chose to manifest his divinity under human conditions. Ramakrishna, having attained by his own internal effort the central illumination, accepted several teachers in the different paths of yoga, but always showed in the manner and swiftness of realization that this acceptance was a concession to the general rule by which effective knowledge must be received as a disciple from a guru. So we see here that even as Bhagavan mastered each of these different practices and traditions, he had a guru, a teacher, only in name. In practice, the swiftness with which he attained to the realization belied the need for any guru, for any external human agency to assist or to initiate him. And it was only, Sri Aurobindo observes, it was only as a concession to the tradition of the guru. And then Sri Aurobindo says of the life and work of Bhagavan, in the life of Ramakrishna Paramahansa, we see a colossal spiritual capacity. First, driving straight to the divine realization, taking as it were the kingdom of heavens by violence, and then seizing upon one yogic method after another, and extracting the substance out of it with an incalculable rapidity, always to return to the heart of the whole matter. And what is that heart? The realization and possession of God by the power of love, by the extension of inborn spirituality into various experience, and by the spontaneous play of an intuitive knowledge. So in Sri Aurobindo's observation, we see some very interesting insights. First, that he says, of course, there is this gigantic spirituality which is involved in this whole effort. But you see Bhagavan going straight through with an incalculable rapidity to the heart of that, to the essence of the practice, and drawing all those essential principles together back to the central objective. And here we begin to get a glimpse of his true mission in the world for humanity and for the larger evolution of Indian spirituality. There is another description which Sri Aurobindo wrote at a very early period of his sadhana, where he says, to exemplify, Bhagavan's work was to exemplify in the great and decisive experience of a master soul the truth now most necessary to humanity, towards which a world long divided into jarring sects and schools is with difficulty laboring. So we have seen thousands of years of division between different schools and sects and traditions and religions. And what is it that it is laboring towards? He says that all sects are forms and fragments of a single integral truth. And all disciplines labor in their different ways towards one supreme experience. This is the work Sri Ramakrishna came to begin. And all the development of the previous 2000 years and more since Buddha appeared has been a preparation for the harmonization of spiritual teaching and experience by the avatar of Dakshineshwar. You see, now he is giving us a massive perspective of history. And all those thousands of years are a preparation for this synthesis, for this unification which Bhagavan came to realize. And then Sri Aurobindo says, a new era dates from his birth. An era in which people will be lifted for a while into communion with God and spirituality become the dominant note of human life. Now consider that this is begun at a time when the large mass of humanity was steeped not only in materialism but in conflicts and division. And then Sri Aurobindo again prophetically points, a new day is about to break, so glorious that even the last of the avatars cannot be sufficient to explain it, although without him it would not have come. So this is the future towards which all this work is to lead. And then finally he says, it is such a synthesis embracing all life and action in its scope that the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda have been preparing. So we get here a glimpse of the larger picture of what it is that he came to accomplish. And for now, briefly, we will step back and look at the full sweep of the history of Indian spirituality and observe the distinctions of stages. Sri Aurobindo explains that nature has a particular method in her evolution. What she does is she begins with a central effort and then from there branches out to different specializations. And when all the specializations are taken to their extreme and it seems as if they are opposing each other, she brings them back again to form a larger, richer unification. And when that is established, again a new cycle of specialization grows out like a tree from its single trunk branching out. And then eventually again, when that extreme has been accomplished of diversity, again these forms are brought together to make for a larger, more complete unification and synthesis. When we see this, when we understand this, we can see better the theme of the unfolding spirituality in India. In the Veda, we find that the spiritual theme is always of an underlying unity. Yes, diversity exists, but the diversity represents only aspects, powers, facets, different potentialities, different directions in which the same unity can develop and unfold. Therefore, we see in the Veda, as the different aspects of the divine are named, the specific powers that they represent, the attributes that they express, with each of these great names of the Vedic deities, we are again and again told, in you are all the other deities. And then the Vedic Rishi shifts to another deity and says, in you are all the other deities. So there is a vision in which the different cosmic powers are all functioning to manifest the universe, but they are all facets of each other, facets of a single underlying oneness. And this is the dominant theme of the Vedic experience. As we move from the Veda to the Vedantic phase, as the Upanishads unfold, we see in the Upanishad a shift. A shift from what was in the Veda an intuitive underlying spiritual experience held in oneness to something now which is articulated in terms of the intellect, the mind. The mind still turns to the Veda, still turns to that unity, but now articulates the differences, the distinctions with greater clarity, greater separateness. And therefore, for the modern mind, which was much more intellectual, it is easier to follow the Upanishads because it is rationally presented, in distinction, in separation, even in opposition. But to go back to the Veda requires us to transcend our intellect, to re-enter into an intuitive consciousness, which is not easy for us right now in our current stage of development. But the Upanishads, therefore, also become the transition point where statements, philosophies or approaches can be placed as if in conflict with each other. As if. Because that is the nature of the intellect. Because it divides, it cuts up and shows differences and similarities, but always in pieces. But each of the Upanishads traces back to the same original oneness and synthesis of the Veda. But by the time we have moved down through various levels in the Upanishadic phase, the distinctions grow. And now it is as if each can branch out to become a whole new school, a whole new tradition, as if seemingly to be in contradiction or separateness from others. We find subsequently in the Puranic phase something very interesting. A further separation, a further distinction, but brought down to the level of the common man. Through simple, childlike narrations of stories, the same great truths of the Veda, the same philosophical articulations of the Upanishads are now presented in simple story form. But at that stage, the Vedic deities have been reduced almost to human types. Indra gets angry, he gets jealous, he starts playing mischief, and all kinds of strange behavior happens, which is very much like us. And it makes it possible for us now to relate to these deities at a human level, although we lose their grandeur and cosmic uniting character. But the principles they represent are now easily accessible subliminally, subconsciously, through these fascinating and profound multidimensional stories. So the mind that comes from a deeper understanding of the Veda and the Upanishads sees these simple stories and sees the deeper truth behind. But the child's mind, which does not see the deeper truth, can still grasp the stories and intuitively absorb the deeper truth without being conscious of it. And so there is a bringing down of those deep realities and truths to a level where the common man now begins to feel them close and begins to absorb them. And it is in this way that the great truths of the Veda became the norm and the formative power of the common Indian culture, which became a spiritual culture. Underlying it is the sense of unity, not always articulated but always felt. And even in the midst of the extreme play of diversity, we know it is there. We know that sense of oneness. The mother of Sri Aurobindo Ashram used to observe that the commonest farmer in India is more spiritually developed than the greatest philosophers of the West. And it's not by the study that he has absorbed that spirituality. It is from this underlying, steeped spiritual culture and value and the forms of life which have emerged from that culture and those values. But already at this point you see how the profound truths have come on the brink of vulgarization. It is easy to misrepresent them or misunderstand them. It is easy to get lost in our own little tradition, in conflict with others whom we now hate or disallow. And so you will find there are statements which come from the bhakti tradition which says, oh, jnana is only necessary to get the realization of bhakti and then it must be dropped. But the jnana tradition will say, oh, bhakti is just an immature preparatory stage before the true knowledge of the divine comes. And all these kinds of distinctions. Obviously, the presiding consciousness, the divine inspiration behind the civilization and the Veda will not allow this to happen. So we find repeatedly through the development of Indian spirituality attempts to synthesize, to reharmonize. The Bhagavad-Gita is one such, where Sri Krishna unites the path of knowledge, the path of devotion, and the path of works. Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, and Karma Yoga are as if seen as one triple path, each merging into the other in a comprehensive, all-encompassing development of our being. We find in the Tantra similarly an attempt to reconnect the every detail of life back to the divine origin, to consecrate oneself and everything we do to the divine Shakti who mediates between us and the divine source. And so there are repeatedly these attempts to synthesize and harmonize. But when religions form, innately they distinguish themselves by separation. They define themselves by cutting off from the other who does not follow. And so there is always a problem of their resolution. If a religion says, my God is greater than your God, how are we to resolve this problem? And philosophy does not help because one can argue either way. It is only in experience that one can resolve this conflict. An experience where my God being attained, your God being attained, we realize they are the same one. But can one person do that? A lifetime is not enough. A lifetime is not enough to realize the highest truth of a single tradition or a single religion. And therefore the soul needs to take birth again and again in a single tradition to realize its highest possibility. And then to take birth again and again in another tradition to realize its highest possibility. It is just not possible for a human being to do it. And this is where the divine intervention has to come. Because for the new age that is dawning on us, the new Satya Yuga, it is a recovery of the deeper and larger synthesis of the Vedic uniting vision that has to be established. And before that can happen, all of these disparate extremes of all the traditions need to be brought back together in a single experience, in a single lifetime of a single person. Humanly impossible. Therefore, the manifestation of Bhagavan Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa. Bhagavan himself describes a vision. And in this vision you will see the deepest spiritual truth of his mission. And it is a vision which has many layers, many deeper spiritual dimensions to it. He describes a vision where he saw from the highest undifferentiated consciousness of oneness, there was gradually a portion that came out and emerged and took the form of a child. And this child, as he descended, came to the 7 rishis, the Sapta rishis who were in deep meditation. And he went to one of them, put his arms around that rishi and said, I am going down to the earth. Will you come with me? And the rishi opens his eyes. He does not speak, but in his gaze there is the acceptance. And then the child goes, the rishi follows. And Ramakrishna Paramahansa explained that this child was he. And the rishi was Swami Vivekananda. It's a very simple description, but in this description you will understand the full import of it. What was his origin? In the undifferentiated oneness of the highest consciousness. Out of that, as if a special emanation comes out, takes on form like a child, And you see in the child the purity, the simplicity which dominated, which was the theme of his life. The highest spiritual experiences, the deepest, profoundest philosophical questions expressed in simple, childlike terms, accessible to a child. The greatest philosophers who came to him with technical philosophical questions went away satisfied by the simple answers which are still available to us in stories that a child can understand, but which hold at the same time profound spiritual and philosophical layers behind the simple appearance of the answer. And so this child comes, and for his work he seeks the assistance of one of the great Saptarishis, who then follows in his wake. And you see also in their life what Ramakrishna Paramahansa embodied spiritually would have perhaps remained in the deeper spiritual imprint of the earth still remains, but the knowledge of his work, the teaching that he spread, the power of his manifestation in form would have been incomplete if not for Swami Vivekananda. And therefore you see a continuity of the work across the two. Of Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo also has a very interesting observation to make, again profound and revealing. He says, and what was Vivekananda? A radiant glance from the eye of Shiva. And you all know the deeper sense of this, that he was himself a special emanation from that original source. And then he says, Sri Aurobindo says, Vivekananda was a soul of puissance, if ever there was one, a very lion among men. It was not just that he was, he speaks of the present now. We perceive his influence still working gigantically. We know not well how, we know not well where. In something that is not yet formed, something leonine, grand, intuitive, upheaving that has entered the soul of India. And we say, behold, Vivekananda still lives in the soul of his mother and in the souls of her children. That is Mother India and we, the children of Mother India. In Sri Aurobindo's own life, as you are aware, some of you would know, he had the inner spiritual contact, guidance and help, both from Sri Ramakrishna Paramahans and Swami Vivekananda. 3 times Bhagavan came to him with a very specific message in the inner worlds. And in the first contact that he had, he said, it was that which gave him the inner push to take up the journey of yoga. And as regards Swami Vivekananda, twice he had a contact with him, again on an inner level. The first when he began his journey in the yoga, beginning with the basic practice of Hatha Yoga and Pranayam, he felt Swami Vivekananda present, supporting. But later when his yoga took an intense turn, and he was in Alipur jail for 1 year in isolation, and his tapasya had gone into a degree of intensity, he said Swami Vivekananda came to him and stayed with him for 2 to 3 weeks and showed him the domains of the higher spiritual worlds and pointed to the upward journey all the way to what Sri Aurobindo later called the supramental consciousness, the supermind. So Sri Aurobindo says, literally, the origin of his own journey began with the push from Ramakrishna Paramahansa, and the formation of the distinctive character of his own yoga is based on the insights that came from Swami Vivekananda. But I've mentioned these in passing. We are looking at the larger picture of their descent upon earth. And you see the descent begins from the undifferentiated consciousness, and therefore when he manifests, it is to reunite all the differentiations. Entering the human birth, he takes on human form, although he is not bound to the human form. And therefore we see some extraordinary features of his life, of his teaching, and of his actions. There were even things which are humanly not possible, biologically, genetically impossible, and yet we see them there. Because in his consciousness, the body was merely a vehicle, a tool in which his spiritual consciousness established itself, wielding it like you would wield a tool, a substance of clay to be molded by his spiritual power and force. So we see very early on his inner intuition and the spiritual dimension of his realizations leaking out through the surface personality. When at the age of 6, he falls into trance, seeing a beautiful scene of the birds flying. Later on, as he goes through the conventional education, he finds it not useful, not necessary, or not interesting, even coming in the way of his greater possibilities, and he drops it. And there again we get a hint of which Sri Aurobindo gives a longer elaboration. Sri Aurobindo explains that there is a particular turn of the Indian mind which is imprinted by that unitive vision of the Vedic consciousness, the Vedic experience. The Indian mind is temperamentally turned towards unity, oneness. It sees things in continuity. It feels the intuition underlying behind. It has a sense of closeness to eternity and infinity. As distinct from the European mind, which sees things linearly, which sees things in fragments, in separateness. And so, Sri Aurobindo explains, when we go through the European form of education, our mind gets distorted into the European imprint. This is a very interesting observation. We get distorted into a sequential, fragmented kind of thinking, which is not natural to the temperament of the Indian consciousness and of the Indian mind. And he says there is a need, a necessity to recover the original stamp of the Indian mind. And it is this which will be the future for humanity, not just for India. But we are passing through a phase, through the Europeanization of the Indian mind, we have passed through a phase of perhaps recovering something of the sharp edge of the intellect, but then to return to a deeper, uniting, intuitive view and consciousness of things. And it is here that we see the glimpses of the Indian genius gradually emerging today. But Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa chose to preserve that and not submit to further distortion from the European framework of education. And we see how this unfolded subsequently. When finally his open spiritual journey began, he was not satisfied with a single path leading to a single realization. He had to go through each of them successively and in each master to reach the highest. And as I said before, this is impossible in a single human lifetime for anybody, any human being. And that's why he had to do it. And you see the speed with which he attains to the realizations of each. When he took to the tantric way, he had mastered 64 different practices within the span of a few years. And through each of them reaching the highest that each of those practices could take him to. When he came to the Vaishnava form, the 5 facets of relationship with the divine, each of them he went into fully, without any sense of hesitation, without any fear, without any limitation, plunging into it, identifying to such an extent that even his body forms changed. As we all know, when he entered into that relationship of the relationship with the divine of the beloved, his body form changed, taking on the shape of a woman, including the growth of his bosom, and he passed even menses. This is biologically impossible, genetically impossible, and yet it happened. Why? And it shows us the body is only a tool, an instrument. The spirit is greater. The spirit can mold the body as it chooses with its intensity of its imprint and power. When, for example, he took the relationship of Hanuman as the devotee of the Lord, his tailbone grew a couple of inches. And these are recorded facts. How can the biology change with the intensity of the psychological and spiritual quest? Science cannot explain, but the reality that we know in the yogic tradition is this: the gross body is only a condensation of the subtle body, the sukshma deha. And when the subtle body in its intensity gives itself, shapes itself, becomes one with its ideal, the gross body is compelled to follow. And the fact that his body itself was so subtle, was so subtilized and intuitivized, that itself shows that what an extraordinary being he was. It shows us also what is possible for all of us if we were to follow in that line of dedicated, complete devotion to the spiritual ideal. There is one other example of his body also, when he observed a bull being beaten, whipped. He felt immediately in identification the pain of the whip on his body. But still the pain could be psychologically felt. On the physical tissue of his body came the marks of the whiplashes. The identification in consciousness immediately, instantly reflected in the substance of his body. Such was the intuitivization and subtilization even of his gross body. And these are extraordinary examples in the history of Indian spirituality, in the history of the world and the world's spirituality. So, in one single being, in one single lifetime, each of these paths were accomplished, mastered, and he could say from his personal experience, I have been to the end of each. It is the same one divine. Now this is an extraordinary statement. Having said it is not enough. It is the realization in himself which now ripples out on the world. Today, for all of us, for all human beings, it is possible now to feel the truth of this statement because it was established in one human being 180 years ago. Because he did it, we can feel the truth of it and we can accept it effortlessly. This is the nature of his true work, whose impact continues and will continue. When thus he unites all these paths, he sets a new pattern in the understanding of humanity. At that point, especially in the European culture, and from there reflected in the Indian tradition, they used to think that the solution for human unity is that everybody should follow one religion. All should speak one language. All should belong to one earth, and so on. To flatten out into uniformity was their idea of human unity. But Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa showed that that is an error. In fact, true human unity can only happen in the acceptance of multiplicity, where each one of us is uniquely able to follow his own line of development, and yet all these lines of development unite at one peak, one realization, one divinity. So the whole paradigm of human evolution, the whole paradigm of human unity was changed into the very opposite of what was prevalent on earth at that time in the mind of humanity. Such is the nature of his work and his mission on earth. With that new paradigm, with his established experience embodied now in humanity, a foundation is laid. A foundation which promises eventually, whatever the struggles we may pass through today, it promises that there will be a unity of all religion, a unity of all cultures, a unity of all human lineages and types and ethnic types. All these different humanities are coming together and will inevitably find their foundation in a deeper spiritual unity. This was the original message of the Veda. This has been re-established now in a new context, in a new form of articulation, in the living embodiment of Bhagavan Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa. Swami Vivekananda then took that realization and articulated it, organized it through the institution that he built up, where we are all seated here, the Ramakrishna Mutt. And so, in this way, spread that ideal and brought that possibility to the minds and hearts of people. The spiritual truth is imprinted already, but now the mind and the heart can understand and follow. And so this is the large sense of the vision which I want to place before you. And in this foundation that he laid, we see the beginning of the new age, the new Satya Yuga. If not for that, the work done subsequently would not be possible. And that is why it is the foundation. He himself did not live in the body to see the beginning of the Satya Yuga, but because he was there in the body, we are given this gift of the beginning of the Satya Yuga. But the story does not end here, because their work is still incomplete. It is not complete until that new age and that new consciousness is established on earth. And that will happen when we participate, when we make the effort along the lines shown by him and embodied by him. It is not possible for all of us to realize the truths of each religion. It is not even necessary, because he has already done it. It is necessary for us to make the effort to feel, to realize in ourselves the essence of what he has embodied. To make the effort to move forward in the same way as he did, even if it is within the limitations of our existing culture, tradition, religion, framework. But carrying that synthetic sense of it, the intuitive perception of the oneness of things, and taking it through to its culmination, to self-realization, to the highest spiritual realization. Bhagavan himself, as you know, having reached the highest status of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, was ordained by the Divine Mother to return to a halfway point where he could form a bridge between that height of spiritual dissolution to the surface form of the world experience. And he remained in this intermediate status as a bridge, precisely so that that highest power could act through him in the world, and he could reach out and draw the world towards the oneness of the Spirit, becoming himself a bridge. And it is thus that we have to relate to him as a bridge who assists us, a conscious living bridge of the Supreme, here manifested on earth in a form that we can see, feel, hear, read about, relate to with the heart, with love, with the mind, with understanding, with the will and the body through service. And in this way, through the bridge, we make the easiest, most rapid link to that spiritual consciousness that he embodied. In this way, we experience and bring into our life the unification of the triple path through karma yoga, through service, through bhakti yoga, through devotion and love, and through jnana yoga, through discrimination and deeper knowledge and understanding of the spiritual reality. But it is done most easily when we can have this personal relationship. It is very difficult to say, I will serve the divine who is formless, anantam, nirgunam, and somewhere in this being he is present. Somewhere in humanity he lives. It's difficult. Some do that because it is natural for them. For most of us it is difficult. But if we can see him in form, if we can know him in form, it is much easier to relate. And this is why Sri Krishna appears before Arjuna and says, I am here, surrender to me. Abandon all the dharmas which limit you and turn to this highest uniting dharma. And I would say it is the same truth that we all should recognize in our relationship with Bhagavan and with Swamiji. That they are beings who are at the same time human and at the same time divine. God incarnate in man. And so in our relationship with them, we can most easily adore, connect, and put into practice and receive their help in our own spiritual journey. As more and more of us make this effort, as India recovers the truth of her uniting spiritual foundations in the Veda, the new Satya Yuga will dawn. That is certain. Whether now or later, whether through a smooth transition or through much pain, that depends on us. That depends on our effort. And that is why a gathering like this is so important, because it is a time when we can remind ourselves of the gift that we have received from them, consciously commit ourselves to the work to be done, and allow their help to lead us. I will close by sharing a personal experience. When I first went to Belur Math, I did not have a very deep background of their specific statements or work. I went to sit before the idol of Bhagavan Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa. For some reason, as I entered the temple, there was a beautiful rainbow at the back. I went inside and I sat down with my eyes open, looking at him. And then as I gazed at him, I noticed something strange. So momentarily my mind was confused. What did I just see? And I stared again and I saw his eyes blink. And I said, oh, perhaps it is some illusion. Perhaps my eyes are tired. I stared again. I noticed his chest breathing, his arm moving. And with full eyes open for 45 minutes that I sat there, I saw him as a living form, conscious, breathing, and emanating his spiritual power. I came back from that deeply moved, and as I went into the museum, I read there on a plaque the statement or the promise that he made to Swami Vivekananda, that wherever you carry me on your shoulders and establish me, I will be present there. And it was also mentioned that it was here that Swami Vivekananda had established him. And this is a great gift. He has not left us. He is still present with the same gigantic power, with the same extraordinary genius, with the same divine swiftness of capacity and skill and strength and energy, ready to share that with us. And the realization that he embodied is also there to be gifted to us. That is the lasting gift that he leaves for humanity. And I will reread the line of Sri Aurobindo's description of Swami Vivekananda, where he says, we perceive his influence still working gigantically. We know not well how. We know not well where. In something that is not yet formed, something leonine, grand, intuitive, upheaving that has entered the soul of India. And we say, behold, Vivekananda still lives in the soul of his mother and in the souls of her children. Namaste.